Welcome back to Great History, your daily history channel. Today's story isn't just about a stone fortress holding out against a sea of nomadic horsemen. It's about a turning point, when military technology began to outweigh mobility, when old steppe warfare met gunpowder head-on, and when a people who had lived under Tatar domination for centuries finally saw a way out of the shadow. If you're here for careful, evidence-based history rather than legend, make sure to subscribe. By the 1500s, Eastern Europe was shaped by three major power blocks, all pulling in different directions. First, there was the Tsardom of Russia, under Ivan IV, Ivan the Terrible, crowned Tsar in 1547. This was a new kind of Russian state, more centralized, more aggressive, and far more ambitious than anything that came before it. Second, the Crimean Khanate, a Tatar state tied closely to the Ottoman Empire. Backed by Ottoman resources and protected by Ottoman diplomacy, the Crimean Tatars specialized in fast cavalry raids, devastating border regions, and feeding the slave markets of the Black Sea. And third, the remnants of the Golden Horde, especially the Khanates of Kazan and Astrakhan, smaller, weaker than in their prime, but still sitting on some of the most valuable real estate in Eurasia. This is where things get interesting. From the moment Ivan IV was crowned Tsar in 1547, his priorities were clear. He wanted absolute authority at home and secure borders abroad, and that meant expansion. Not west, where Poland-Lithuania stood strong, but east and south, where steppe routes, river trade, and old Mongol successor states still blocked Moscow's rise. At the center of that problem sat Kazan. Kazan was a Tatar Khanate on the Volga River, and on a map it doesn't look enormous, but economically and strategically it was a choke point. Whoever controlled Kazan controlled traffic along the Volga, which was Russia's main highway to Central Asia and the Caspian Sea. Furs, salt, horses, silver. This wasn't abstract trade. It was real money, real leverage, and real power. Moscow had tried to break Kazan before, and failed. Repeatedly. There were major Russian campaigns against Kazan in 1467, 1469, 1547, and 1550. Each time the result was frustratingly similar. Russian armies could march, fight, even win battles, but they couldn't finish the job. Why? Logistics. Moving tens of thousands of men through forests and riverlands, feeding them, supplying gunpowder and artillery, was still incredibly hard in the mid-16th century. On top of that, every campaign risked something worse, nomadic intervention from the south. Steppe cavalry could appear suddenly, cut supply lines, and vanish before a response was possible. So each earlier expedition stalled, withdrew, or settled for temporary arrangements that solved nothing. By 1552, Ivan decided that wasn't good enough. This time, Moscow prepared an army on a scale never before assembled for an eastern campaign. Not just more soldiers, but different soldiers. Elite streltsy, the firearm-armed guard units loyal directly to the Tsar. A large artillery train, hauling heavy cannon capable of battering stone walls. And crucially, foreign military engineers, specialists in mining and siegecraft, brought in to solve the one problem Kazan relied on, its fortifications. This was a full-scale, state-level effort to end the Kazan question once and for all. But here's the catch. By committing so much force eastward, Ivan exposed Russia's southern flank. That southern border wasn't empty wilderness. It was watched closely by the Crimean Khanate. The Crimean Khanate, ruled by the Giray dynasty, was a key vassal of the Ottoman Empire. From Constantinople's perspective, Crimea was a forward blade pointed straight at Christian Eastern Europe. From the Khan's perspective, Muscovy was something else entirely. a reservoir of captives and tribute. Every year, Crimean forces launched Chambali raids, fast-moving cavalry expeditions designed to burn villages, seize prisoners, and retreat before an army could react. Tens of thousands of people over decades were dragged south and sold into slavery through Ottoman markets, a highly profitable system. If Kazan fell, the entire northern Tatar system would crack. Crimea would lose a key partner, and Moscow would suddenly be free to turn its full attention southward. And that was the nightmare scenario. The Crimean leadership understood the timing perfectly. Ivan IV was marching east with his main army. Moscow itself was left comparatively exposed. So the Crimean Khanate chose a strategic counterstrike. The goal was to force Ivan to turn back. If the Khan could threaten Moscow directly, Ivan would have no choice but to abandon the Kazan campaign, or risk losing his capital. And for that plan, there was one place that mattered more than any other: Tula. Tula sat about 200 kilometers, roughly 125 miles, south of Moscow, directly astride the Moravsky Trail. This trail was a natural invasion corridor, a strip of open land that nomadic cavalry had used for generations because it avoided major rivers and forests. If you wanted to reach the heart of Russia fast, this was the route. That alone made Tula important, but its significance went much deeper. Geographically, Tula was a hard stop on the Moravsky Trail. Politically, it was the gateway to Ryazan lands and the broader southern frontier. Economically, it was already emerging as a metalworking and forging center, the early ancestor of what would later become Russia's arms manufacturing capital. Losing it would mean more than territory. It would mean losing production capacity and skilled labor. And militarily, Tula was one of the key links in what Russians called the Great Abatis Border. This wasn't a single wall like the Great Wall of China. It was a layered defensive system: felled trees, earthworks, forts, rivers, and fortified towns designed to slow down and channel steppe raids long enough for reinforcements to arrive. Tula was one of its most critical anchors. At that moment, Tula was not just a town, it was a tripwire. If Tula fell, the Crimean cavalry could sweep through Ryazan, bypass weaker defenses, and reach Moscow in a matter of days. Even worse, Ivan IV, hundreds of kilometers away at Kazan, would be cut off from his rear. Messages wouldn't get through. Reinforcements couldn't move safely. The entire Kazan campaign could collapse without a single battle being fought there. So when the Crimean army moved north, Tula was the obvious target. But here's something you need to know. Tula's ability to withstand a massive Tatar force was the result of decades of planning, going all the way back to the reign of Vasily III, Ivan's father. By the early 1500s, the pressure on Russia's southern frontier was constant. Raids from the steppe were becoming more frequent, larger, and better coordinated, and Moscow could see the trend clearly. In 1507, Grand Prince Vasily III decided that Tula could no longer remain a lightly defended outpost. He ordered the construction of a solid oak fortress on the left bank of the Upa River. The work moved fast by the standards of the time. By 1509, the wooden fortress was complete. Thick oak walls, watchtowers, earthworks, enough perhaps to stop a traditional cavalry raid. But warfare was changing. Artillery was becoming common, even among steppe armies, and wood, no matter how thick, burned, splintered, and collapsed under cannon fire. That realization led to a second, far more ambitious decision. In 1514, Vasily III issued a new decree. Tula would get a stone city, built inside the existing wooden walls. The model was clear and deliberate, the Moscow Kremlin itself. This was a statement that Tula was no longer a frontier town. It was becoming a permanent fortress of state importance. Construction took several years, and by 1520 to 1521, the new Tula Kremlin was finished. What emerged was something unusual for Russia at the time: a hybrid defensive system. Traditional Russian fortress concepts, thick walls, compact layout, inward-facing defense, were combined with Western European fortification techniques, especially those influenced by Italian military architects, who were reshaping fortress design across Europe in the age of gunpowder. And yet, the most surprising choice wasn't the stone. Most fortresses of the era were built on hills, cliffs, or high ground. Height meant visibility and advantage. Tula broke that rule completely. The Kremlin was built down in the river valley, in low ground beside the Upa. Strange enough. In fact, it gave Tula three major tactical advantages. First, water security. In siege warfare, defenders usually didn't lose because the walls fell. They lost because they ran out of water. By sitting right next to the Upa River, Tula's garrison had a reliable, uninterrupted water supply, even during long blockades. That alone could extend resistance from days to weeks or months. Second, artillery dominance. Flat terrain worked with gunpowder weapons. Cannons mounted on the walls didn't have their view blocked by slopes or ridges. They could fire straight across open ground, sweeping attackers from left to right. For nomadic forces used to speed and maneuver, this created dead zones, open killing fields with nowhere to hide. And third, the ground itself became a weapon. The Upa Valley was naturally marshy and waterlogged. Heavy siege towers sank. Wagons bogged down. Cavalry, normally the greatest strength of steppe armies, lost speed, cohesion, and shock power. Charging a wall under artillery fire is dangerous. Doing it while your horses are struggling through mud? That's catastrophic. So what looked like a vulnerability was actually a trap. The Tula Kremlin was laid out as a near-perfect rectangle, enclosing roughly 6 hectares, or about 15 acres. Every meter of space inside mattered, because this was meant to absorb pressure. The walls alone tell you how seriously this place was taken. They stretched for about 1,000 meters in total, just over half a mile, completely encircling the town's core. The construction was layered and deliberate. At the base, builders used white limestone, chosen for strength and resistance to moisture. Above that rose red brick, lighter, more flexible under impact, and far better at absorbing the shock of cannon fire than solid stone alone. In places, the walls reached 10 meters high, about the height of a 3-story building. That's tall enough to defeat ladders and siege towers, but height alone wasn't the real defense. Thickness was. The walls were up to 3.2 meters thick, wide enough for defenders to move along the top and strong enough to withstand repeated artillery hits from 16th century cannons. Underneath all of this was the part no attacker ever saw: the foundation. It went down nearly 9 meters into the ground. Tula sat on soft, waterlogged soil. Without deep foundations, the walls would crack, shift, or collapse. Just as importantly, that depth made undermining almost impossible. Dig a tunnel toward Tula's walls, and you'd likely hit water before you hit stone. Now add the towers. There were 9 towers in total, 4 of them gate towers, and they were the real teeth of the fortress. Each tower projected outward from the wall, allowing defenders to fire along the face of the walls, not just straight ahead. This created overlapping fields of fire, what modern soldiers would call interlocking kill zones. Each tower had 3 to 4 firing levels, with loopholes positioned for different purposes: direct fire, crossfire, and vertical fire, straight down onto attackers at the base of the walls. Anyone who reached the wall wasn't almost in. They were already trapped. The Ivanovskaya Tower shows just how sophisticated this system was. It included a hidden tunnel leading to the river, allowing defenders to draw water during a siege, or slip out for a sudden counterattack when attackers least expected it. Small detail, huge implications. In a siege, surprises like that could change everything. Now put that fortress in your mind, and then we move to what was coming toward it. 120,000 Crimean warriors. That figure comes mainly from sources like the Nikon Chronicle and court records, which describe Devlet I Gire's army as a sea of people covering the fields. But 16th century chronicles weren't written as statistical reports. Numbers were often symbolic, meant to convey scale and terror rather than precision. Modern historians have tried to peel that back. Scholars like Nikolai Karamzin and Vitaly Penskoy asked a simple but crucial question. How many men could the steppe actually support on campaign? They suggest 30,000 to 40,000 Crimean Tatar cavalry, experienced, fast, and battle-hardened. On top of that came supporting forces, Nogai detachments, Circassian warriors, and, most critically, a contingent of Ottoman janissaries, backed by Turkish artillery. A Crimean Tatar warrior usually brought 2 or 3 horses, one to fight, one to travel, one as reserve. Do the math. With 40,000 riders, you're looking at over 120,000 horses moving across the steppe. So was it really 120,000 soldiers? Almost certainly not. However, even at the lowest serious estimate, the Kazan Khanate brought a force vastly larger than Tula's garrison. On June 21, 1552, advanced detachments of Khan Devlet I Gire appeared on the outskirts of Tula. At first, the Russian defenders misread what they were seeing. To anyone used to life on the southern frontier, this looked familiar. These kinds of hit-and-run slave raids happened regularly. But this time, that assumption was dangerously wrong. What Devlet Gire had actually launched was a reconnaissance by fire. Captured prisoners near Ryazan provided exactly the intelligence he needed. They told him that Ivan IV and the main Russian army were at Kolomna, preparing to march east toward Kazan. In other words, the road south was suddenly exposed. Devlet Gire ordered his entire hidden force, tens of thousands of riders who had been waiting beyond the horizon, to move immediately on Tula. The opportunity was too rare to waste. At dawn on June 22nd, the people of Tula woke up to a sight few had ever seen. The sky darkened with dust. Tens of thousands of horses churned the steppe into a rolling brown haze as the main Crimean army arrived. By mid-morning, Tula was fully encircled. And then something happened that marked a clear break from earlier Tatar raids. This time, the attackers brought heavy firepower. Instead of relying mainly on bows and mobility, Devlet Gire deployed Ottoman artillery and Janissary musketeers. Cannons were positioned, and before the day was over, the fortress was under continuous bombardment. The sound alone would have been terrifying. Deep, echoing booms rolling across the valley hour after hour. Stone shot and incendiary rounds crashed into the town. Inside the walls, wooden houses caught fire, one after another. Smoke filled courtyards and streets. This was an attempt to burn Tula out from the inside. And yet, the fortress itself held. The 3.2-meter thick brick walls absorbed the impact. Cracks appeared. Debris fell, but the core structure stayed intact. Ottoman guns, powerful as they were, simply weren't enough to smash through in a single day. Men, women, and even the elderly worked side by side with the garrison. Fires were beaten down with buckets hauled from the river. Powder and shot were carried up narrow stairways to the towers. Wounded defenders were dragged back from the parapets as fresh hands stepped forward. From the towers and gatehouses, Russian marksmen went to work. The design of the Kremlin now paid off in full. Fire came not just straight out, but from the sides and from above. Any Tatar unit that tried to move close enough to place ladders found itself caught in crossfire. Losses mounted quickly. The attackers learned, fast, that approaching the walls in daylight was suicide. When night finally fell over Tula, the scene inside the fortress was grim. Smoke from burning houses hung thick in the air, stinging the eyes and making it hard to breathe. Outside the walls, the shouts, drums, and animal cries from the Tatar camp never really stopped. It was loud enough, constant enough to wear people down, and yet morale inside Tula didn't collapse. What held it together was a single belief: help was coming. Everyone knew the Tsar was far away, but they also knew that if Tula fell, Moscow itself would be exposed. That shared understanding kept the defenders and the civilians on their feet through the night. The second day of the siege, June 23rd, was even more intense. By now, Devlet I Giray understood that the fortress wouldn't crumble on its own. So the focus shifted to the most vulnerable points: the gate towers. Tatar units concentrated their efforts there, supported by cannon fire and Janissary musketeers. Inside the Kremlin, the defenders were being squeezed hard. And that's when the commander of Tula made a decision that could easily have ended in disaster. Instead of pulling everyone deeper inside the fortress, they opened the gates. In a sudden, violent sortie, Russian soldiers rushed straight out of the Kremlin and slammed into the Crimean artillery positions just outside the walls. This was brutal, close-range fighting under the fortress towers. Swords, axes, and firearms at arm's length. Several Crimean guns were damaged or disabled, and the rhythm of the Ottoman bombardment was broken. For the attackers, it was a shock. For the defenders, it was proof that they could still strike back. But even as this fighting raged, something else was also happening. Crimean scouts soon brought Devlet Giray alarming news. A large relief force was on the move. Ivan IV's response to the siege was not what the Khan had hoped for. Instead of abandoning the Kazan campaign entirely, the Tsar made a far riskier choice. He kept pressing east, but dispatched a rapid response force of about 15,000 elite troops westward toward Tula. The commanders were Prince Mikhail Vorotinsky and Andrei Kurbsky, both experienced, aggressive leaders. To amplify the effect, Ivan ordered scouts to light fires and raise banners along the route. From a distance, it looked like the entire Muscovite army was marching south. Exactly the nightmare scenario Devlet Giray wanted to avoid. Now the Khan faced a deadly possibility: being trapped between a fortress that refused to fall and a fresh army approaching fast. By the evening of June 23rd, Devlet I Giray made his decision. The siege was lifted. The Crimean army began withdrawing south along the Moravsky Trail. But retreating wasn't as easy as attacking. The Crimean force was slowed by wagons full of loot, prisoners, and, most critically, heavy Ottoman artillery. Speed, their usual advantage, was gone. By the morning of June 24th, Vorotinsky's troops caught up with the rear of the retreating army near the Shivron River, and there the situation collapsed. Despite exhaustion from a forced march, the Russian troops attacked with remarkable coordination. Streltsy units, armed with arquebuses, poured disciplined musket fire into lightly armored Tatar cavalry. At close range, the effect was devastating. The retreat turned into chaos. Russian prisoners captured during the earlier raids were freed in the confusion. Ottoman guns and supply wagons were seized intact. Losing artillery was bad enough, but losing it while fleeing was a blow to Devlet Giray's prestige that echoed all the way to Constantinople. One figure stood out in the fighting: Andrei Kurbsky. He fought at the front, was badly wounded, and emerged from the battle as a celebrated hero. An ironic twist, considering he would later become one of Ivan IV's most famous critics. By the end of the day, the message was clear. Tula had held, the Crimean offensive had failed, and the southern frontier of Russia, at least for that year, was secure. The question now was what this failure would mean for Devlet-Giray, and how the Ottoman world would respond to such a public setback. If Tula had fallen in June of 1552, Russian history would look very different today. At that exact moment, Ivan IV was in the middle of moving tens of thousands of troops and heavy artillery east toward Kazan. Cannons, powder wagons, engineers, supply trains. This was not an army that could just turn around on short notice. A collapse in the south would have set off a domino effect almost immediately. Confidence would have evaporated. Many of Ivan's allies, border princes, local nobles, and semi-autonomous groups, were loyal as long as Moscow looked strong. If Tula fell and Crimean cavalry suddenly poured north, that image of control would shatter. In the 16th century, loyalty often followed momentum, not ideology. Then logistics would break down. The main supply route from Moscow to the Kazan army ran through Ryazan and the southern corridor protected by Tula. If Crimean forces controlled that space, Ivan's army at Kazan would be cut off. An isolated army, no matter how large, doesn't last long. And last Ivan would have been forced to abandon the Kazan campaign. Immediately, Moscow itself would be at risk. Kazan, seeing that pressure lifted, would have repaired its walls, regrouped its defenders, and prepared for another decade of resistance. But that's not what happened, because Tula held. Thanks to the fortress and its defenders, Ivan IV was able to stay focused. In August and September of 1552, he carried out a 38-day siege of Kazan, using heavy artillery, professional infantry, and siege engineers. On October 2, 1552, Kazan fell, and with it, Russian control expanded permanently along the Volga River. That single outcome reshaped Russia's economy, trade routes, and imperial future. And Tula didn't just save one campaign, it reshaped Russian defense strategy for centuries. The events of 1552 proved something crucial. Layered defense works could stop even massive steppe armies. After this, Tula became the anchor point for an enormous defensive system known as the Great Zasechnaya Line. It was a network stretching hundreds of kilometers, built from forts, watchtowers, earthworks, and engineered forest barriers. Trees were felled and interwoven in dense patterns called zaseki, designed to block and slow fast-moving cavalry. Against nomadic armies that relied on speed, this was devastating. For nearly 200 years, this system helped shield central Russia from large-scale Tatar invasions. Raids still happened, but strategic breakthroughs became far rarer. That constant pressure shaped the city itself. Tula's role as the southern shield meant it lived under the permanent threat of war. Over time, that necessity turned into expertise. By the 17th century, as Russia's borders pushed farther south, Tula no longer sat right on the edge of danger. But history has a funny way of reusing the same places for different roles. In 1632, Tsar Michael Romanov granted permission to establish major ironworks in Tula, led by the Dutch industrialist Andreas Vinius. Fast forward about 80 years. In 1712, Peter the Great stepped in and made it official. He ordered the construction of the Tula arms plant, which marked the beginning of Tula's transformation into the core of Russia's arms industry, a role it would hold for centuries, right into the modern era. For generations, a large share of Russia's rifles came from Tula. The same industrial base, expanded and modernized over time, supplied rifles and machine guns during World War I, and then again during World War II. Few cities anywhere in Europe can say they armed an army across that many centuries, and that long arc started because Tula had once been forced to survive under constant threat. More episodes like this are on the way, so consider subscribing if you don't want to miss them. If you've studied this period or worked with related archives, I genuinely welcome your perspective below. And if you disagree with an interpretation or think a source points in a different direction, leave a comment. Thank you for staying with me to the end. I'll see you in the next episode tomorrow. In 1569, the Ottoman Empire tried something bold, almost visionary. Grand Vizier Sokolu Mehmed Pasha approved a plan to dig a canal linking the Don and the Volga rivers. If the Ottomans could float ships from the Black Sea into the Caspian, they could squeeze Persia from the north and push Russian influence out of the lower Volga entirely. Control the rivers. Control the region. The steppe turned the campaign into a logistical nightmare. Supplies froze. Horses died. Men collapsed from cold and exhaustion. And on top of that, Russian forces holding Astrakhan, led by Prince Serebryanyi, refused to break. As the Ottoman army withdrew, Circassian fighters harassed them relentlessly. By the time the remnants staggered back, more than 70% of the Ottoman force was gone, killed by weather, starvation, and constant attacks. That disaster mattered far beyond Astrakhan. It left a vacuum, and the Crimean Khanate rushed in to fill it. Devlet I-Girai, the Crimean Khan, drew a clear lesson from the Ottoman failure: no more slow campaigns, engineering projects, or sieges. And in 1571, he saw his opening. Russia was exhausted by the long Livonian War. Internally, Ivan IV's Oprichnina had shattered command structures and trust within the state. The defenses along the Oka River, Russia's traditional southern shield, looked solid on maps, but they had gaps. Devlet Girai found them. That year, he led an army of around 60,000 cavalry straight through the wild fields, bypassed Russian forces, and rode directly to Moscow. What followed was catastrophic. The city burned, almost entirely, within 3 hours. Contemporary estimates speak of 80,000 dead and 150,000 people dragged away into slavery. The Khan was only stopped because there was nothing left to burn. The shock of 1,571 forced change. Ivan IV dismantled the Oprichnina. Military reforms followed. And when Devlet Girai tried again the next year, in 1572, he ran into something new at Molodi, a system. The Russians used Gulyai Gorod, mobile field fortifications combined with infantry firepower, and crushed the Crimean army. That victory saved the Russian state, but the lesson cut deeper than one battle. Russian leaders now understood stone fortresses and heroic last stands were useless on their own against steppe cavalry. The wild fields were too open, too vast. Defense had to be layered, flexible, coordinated. By the 1580s, under the supervision of Boris Godunov, a new defensive logic took shape. Forward patrols, mobile units, early warning, infantry, cavalry, and artillery working together. The goal wasn't to stop raids at the border. It was to slow them, bleed them, and force them into unfavorable fights. After Ivan the Terrible died in 1584, Russia's real power quietly shifted. The new Tsar, Fyodor, was gentle, deeply religious, and frankly not built for governing a massive, vulnerable state. So the job fell to Boris Godunov, his brother-in-law, who effectively ran the country as regent. Ivan IV ruled through fear, mass executions, terror campaigns, and shock. Godunov went the opposite way. He believed the state survived on organization, predictability, and defense. In his view, Russia's real strength came from two things: a loyal class of service nobles who knew what they were defending, and borders that actually worked. And by worked, he didn't mean lines on a map. Under Godunov, Russia launched one of the largest fortress-building programs in its history. Between the late 1580s and 1590s, entirely new cities were planted deep along Russia's southern frontier. Samara in 1586, Tsaritsyn, today's Volgograd, in 1589, Saratov in 1590. Each of these was a military node sat along major rivers like the Volga. These waterways were highways, fast, reliable, and dangerous if left unguarded. Control the rivers, and you control movement, trade, and warning time. Lose them, and enemy cavalry could appear before anyone even knew they were coming. All of this fed into a massive defensive system known as the Bank Line, which ran roughly along the Oka River. But the real backbone was the Abatis Line, or Zasekhnaya Kherta, a layered system designed to slow, confuse, and expose attackers, especially steppe cavalry like the Crimean Tatars and Nogai. First came the Zaseki-wide forest zones, where trees were cut and dropped toward the enemy. Hundreds of acres of sharpened trunks tangled together. Impossible for horses to cross at speed. That alone changed everything, but it didn't stop there. Scattered along high ground were storozi, tiny watchposts with just 2 to 6 soldiers each. Dust clouds on the horizon. Smoke. Movement. One signal fire could mean the difference between a prepared defense and a slaughtered village. Then came the stanitsi, mobile cavalry patrols, usually 10 to 20 men, riding far out into the steppe. Their job was intelligence. Where is the enemy? How many? Which direction? An early warning radar system ran on horses and experience. Put all of this together, and the so-called wild field, once a wide-open invasion highway, turned into a dangerous buffer zone. Raiders could still enter, but they couldn't move fast, hide, or surprise anyone anymore. And that loss of surprise was fatal. The campaign kicked off in the summer of 1591. Khan Azaikigirai, riding alongside his brother Fedi I Giray, led the army north along the Muravsky Trail. This route was the main invasion corridor of the steppe, running along the Dnieper and Seversky Donets river basins. Open ground, perfect for speed. The southern reconnaissance network picked up the movement early through the Abatis system. But here's where Azagire showed real skill. Instead of driving straight north with everything he had, he split his forces into smaller raiding groups. These units slammed into multiple points along the Oka defensive line, lighting fires, attacking outposts, and triggering alarms all along the frontier. From the Russian side, it looked like chaos. Voivodes, regional military governors, were pulled in different directions at once, each convinced their sector was the main target. And for a moment, that illusion worked. While Russian commanders were busy responding to these scattered attacks, the Crimean main force quietly found a weak point, crossed the Oka River, and turned straight toward Moscow. The exact scenario ended with Moscow in flames in 1571. Unlike Ivan IV's frantic response 20 years earlier, the government of Tsar Fyodor leaned on paperwork, the Razryadne Knigi, or military appointment registers, laid out who commanded whom, where units were stationed, and how fast they could be assembled. So instead of scrambling, Moscow activated a plan. Within a short window, roughly 30,000 troops were concentrated around the capital, large enough to resist a massive cavalry army, but organized enough not to collapse under its own weight. First came the Streltsy, between 6,000 and 10,000 men, depending on the muster list. These were professional infantry armed with matchlock firearms. Slow to reload. Yes, but devastating when deployed behind earthworks or wagon defenses. Backing them up was the Pomysno Voisko, the service nobility cavalry. These men fought in armor, carrying lances and sabers. and were tied directly to the state through land grants. Their role was discipline, hold the line, counterattack when the moment was right. And then there was the artillery, the pushkari, operating light and medium bronze cannons cast in Moscow's own foundries. These were field guns, mobile, reliable, and terrifying to horses. One well-placed shot could punch a hole straight through a cavalry formation, or at least convince it to veer away. Before the fighting even began, Moscow was already on edge. People still remembered 1571, when the city burned in a single afternoon and tens of thousands died. No one wanted a repeat. So this time, something different happened. Soldiers, clergy, and civilians gathered together and prayed before one specific image, the icon of Our Lady of the Dawn. According to tradition, this same icon had protected Prince Dmitry Donskoy more than 2 centuries earlier, during the Battle of Kulikovo in 1380, when Russian forces faced Khan Mamai of the Golden Horde. That battle had become legendary, the moment when Russia first proved it could stand up to steppe power. So when the icon was brought out again in 1591, the message was clear. History was watching. On July 13, Itchen Wubai Joshiyi, the Crimean army finally showed up on the southern approaches to Moscow. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. Tens of thousands of riders spread out across the open ground south of the city. Boris Godunov didn't rush his troops behind the stone walls of Moscow. Instead, he chose a very specific spot to make his stand: the open ground between the Danilov Monastery and the Donskoy Monastery. The terrain there was firm enough for artillery, close enough to the city for support, and open enough to deny the Crimean cavalry any surprise flanking moves. And this is where the Russians revealed their real trump card. They rolled out the Golden Horde, literally, the walking city, a series of thick oak shields, each mounted on wagons or sleds. Each panel had firing slits for muskets and small cannons. The shields could be locked together into straight lines, corners, or even rough circles, depending on the terrain. Think of it like medieval Lego, except every piece could kill you. In the summer of 1591, this system became a breakwater, a solid wall designed to absorb wave after wave of steppe cavalry without breaking. For the first week, the Crimean cavalry didn't commit fully. Instead, small units probed the Russian positions, darting in and out, trying to pull Russian horsemen into the open. This had worked countless times before, but something felt wrong. The Russians didn't retreat into Moscow. They stayed put, lined up behind wooden walls that moved when needed. Every time Crimean riders approached, musket fire snapped back at them, controlled, almost calm. By the end of July, Asa Giray decided hesitation was more dangerous than risk. He ordered a full-scale cavalry attack, aiming straight at the center of the Golden Horde. Thousands of riders surged forward, and then the firing started. From behind the oak panels, Streltsy musketeers unleashed volleys at point-blank range. Matchlocks aren't fast, but when you fire them into dense cavalry formations, speed doesn't matter. Horses went down, riders tumbled, momentum vanished. The Crimean arrows, deadly in open maneuver warfare, simply thudded into oak planks and stuck there. They couldn't suppress the gunners behind the walls. Then the Russian artillery joined in. From inside the camp and from Moscow's watchtowers, field cannons and lighter guns fired into packed formations of cavalry. The noise alone spooked horses. The explosions tore gaps where charges were supposed to punch through. The walking city held. Weeks passed. Supplies thinned. Horses grew exhausted. And then, on August 9, during another heavy assault, Jazu II Giray was wounded. Accounts differ on whether it was a musket ball or a piece of shrapnel from a cannon. But the details mattered less than the rumor. The Khan is down. That message rippled through the steppe ranks almost instantly. These armies were coalitions of clans and tribes, held together by prestige and momentum. Once doubt set in, cohesion unraveled. By this point, many units had been fighting for weeks without a breakthrough. Something steppe cavalry was never designed for. They were built for shock, speed, and terror, and none of that was working anymore. Realizing Moscow couldn't be taken, and knowing Russian forces were beginning to maneuver for a counter-encirclement, Azugirai gave the order to withdraw south. When Azugirai's main army finally pulled back, the fighting moved south and east, into the regions of Ryazan and Tula. This was the dangerous phase people often forget, because retreating steppe armies could still be lethal. Az's younger brother, Fetish Giray, split off with a large detachment. If Moscow couldn't be taken, they would make up the losses in people and plunder. That meant burning villages, seizing livestock, and capturing civilians to sell as slaves, standard practice for Crimean raids, and normally devastatingly effective. But this wasn't the Ryazan of old. In 1237, when Batu Khan arrived, old Ryazan had been erased almost overnight by 1591. That world was gone. The new city, Pereyaslav-Ryazansky, what we now call Ryazan, sat directly on the Oka defensive system. It was a fortified military hub, tied into the same warning and patrol network that had saved Moscow weeks earlier. Local garrisons weren't huge, often a few hundred men per fortress, but they didn't operate alone. Mobile patrol units, known as stanitsi, usually 10 to 20 cavalrymen, roamed far ahead of the main defenses. Their job was to watch, report, and strike when the enemy was vulnerable. By this point, the Crimean cavalry was exhausted. Horses had been ridden hard for weeks. Supplies were thin. Morale was shaken after failing to break Moscow's defenses. Instead of moving freely across open steppes, they found themselves squeezed between river crossings, fortified towns, and the tangled forests of the Abatis line, where felled trees and marshy ground made fast movement nearly impossible. That's when the ambushes began. Small Crimean raiding parties moved out to loot villages and didn't come back. Others were hit while crossing rivers, attacked from tree cover where cavalry couldn't maneuver. Every skirmish cost men, horses, and time, and each loss made the next one harder to absorb. Then Russian field forces advancing from Moscow finally caught up with the retreating columns. Instead of one dramatic battle, what followed was a grinding collapse. Rear guards were overrun. Groups were cut off and surrounded. Thousands of steppe warriors were killed or captured. And just as important, most of the captives they had taken were freed along the roads and riverbanks. For a raiding army, that was catastrophic. Slaves weren't just loot, they were the economic purpose of the campaign. And then the Crimean cavalry withdrew. Almost immediately after the danger passed, Tsar Fyodor, I gave a symbolic order, right on the spot where the Gulye Gorod had stood, where wooden shields, tannons, and streltsy muskets had formed the last line of defense. He ordered the construction of a monastery, Donskoy Monastery. The site was south of the Kremlin, exactly along the most dangerous approach route used by steppe armies for centuries. In practical terms, the monastery became part of Moscow's southern defensive ring, with thick stone walls and watchtowers that could serve real military purposes. In spiritual terms, it marked the battlefield as sacred ground, proof that faith and force had worked together. Even the details reinforce that blend. The monastery is often credited to Fyodor Khan, the same master builder responsible for the massive stone walls of Smolensk, one of the strongest fortresses in Eastern Europe. This was a hardened structure, designed to stop armies, just like the mobile fortress it replaced. Inside, the monastery housed its most important relic, the icon of Our Lady of the Dawn itself, the image soldiers believed had shielded them during the battle. For future generations, That icon became a reminder that Moscow had survived not just because of walls and guns, but because it had believed it could survive. And standing quietly at the center of all these changes was Boris Godunov. Before 1591, he was already powerful, a regent in all but name. After the victory, his status changed. To many contemporaries, he became the man who had saved the state. He had strengthened the defenses, coordinated the response, and kept the capital from collapse. When Russia later faced a question it had never truly confronted before, who could rule without Rurik blood, that reputation mattered more than lineage. It opened the door for Godunov to become the first Tsar of Russia, not descended from the ancient dynasty. But the consequences of 1591 didn't stop at Moscow's walls. The failure of Azu-Tugere shook the Crimean Khanate to its core. When the Khan limped back south, wounded and empty-handed, the political damage was immediate. Among the Tatar nobility, anger spread fast. Raids were supposed to bring captives, wealth, and prestige. This one had brought the opposite: thousands of losses, freed slaves, and a public retreat from Moscow's walls. Even worse, word reached Istanbul. The Ottoman Sultan, who expected results from his vassal on the northern frontier, was openly displeased. A failed raid could be forgiven. A failed invasion that exposed weakness, that was dangerous. So Azu-Tugere faced a grim calculation: push forward, risk rebellion at home and retaliation from Russia, or step back and negotiate. In the end, survival won. By 1594, Crimea and Russia were sitting at the same table. The treaty looked familiar. Russia agreed to send an annual gift of 10,000 rubles to the Khan. To put that number in perspective, this was a serious sum, roughly equivalent to the yearly pay of several thousand soldiers, but it was still far cheaper than mobilizing an army every summer. In return, the Crimean Khanate promised to halt raids, withdraw from disputed border zones, and recognize the existing defensive lines. But the real meaning of the treaty wasn't in the money. For the first time, the Crimean Khanate implicitly admitted something unthinkable a generation earlier. Moscow could no longer be destroyed by force. The era when a single, successful raid could burn the capital and break the Russian state was over. That realization mattered more than any clause written on parchment, and the consequences were enormous. Before 1591, Russia had been trapped in a defensive crouch. Every year, as many as 65,000 men, cavalry, infantry, garrison troops, were tied down guarding the southern frontier. That's an army roughly twice the size of what actually fought at Moscow in 1591. After the treaty, that burden eased dramatically. So where did those freed resources go east and west? To the east, Russian forces pushed deeper into Siberia, following the river systems beyond the Urals. Forts, trading posts, and Cossack detachments advanced hundreds of miles in just a few decades. To the west, attention shifted toward the Baltic, where access to trade routes and eventually confrontation with Sweden and Poland-Lithuania became the new strategic priority. To hold this new southern line, Russia leaned into the Cossacks instead of state armies. Both Don and Zaporozhian Cossack communities were gradually turned from semi-independent frontier warriors into an informal but powerful defensive shield. They lived where the state couldn't easily govern, along rivers, in open steppe zones, and they fought exactly the kind of fast, mobile warfare needed to counter Tatar cavalry. If Crimean riders crossed the frontier, Cossack scouts usually knew first and reacted first. That shift mattered more than it sounds. It meant the frontier no longer depended entirely on massive, expensive mobilizations from Moscow. Defense became layered, local, and continuous. And once people felt safer, something else followed, almost automatically: migration. For centuries, the region known as the Wild Fields had been a killing zone. Rich soil, yes, But farming there was basically a gamble with your life. After 1591, that calculation slowly changed. As raids declined and defenses held, Russian peasants began moving south in large numbers. Not thousands, hundreds of thousands over time. They cleared land, planted grain, built villages, and turned some of the most fertile soil in Europe into working farmland. This demographic shift laid the groundwork for Russia's explosive economic growth in the 17th and 18th centuries. Grain surpluses, population growth, deeper tax bases. All of it traces back to the moment when the southern frontier stopped collapsing every generation. This episode really only clicks when you see it as one link in a much longer chain, what came before it, and what unfolded after. There are more episodes like this coming, moments that don't always get the spotlight, but quietly change the trajectory of entire regions. If you don't want to miss where this goes next, consider subscribing and checking out the rest of the series here on the channel. And if you've studied this period yourself, if you've worked with archives, dexers, or regional histories, I'd honestly love to hear your take. If you think an interpretation goes too far, or a source points in a different direction, leave a comment. That's how this work stays honest. Thanks for sticking with me all the way to the end. I'll see you tomorrow, in the next episode. Eastern Europe looked like a construction site after an earthquake. The old power that had once dominated the region, the Golden Horde, had collapsed. And what remained were fragments, khanates, duchies, borderlands, and rising states, all trying to redefine themselves. One of those rising states was Ivan IV, better known as Ivan the Terrible. When he crowned himself Tsar, he wasn't just upgrading his business card. The word Tsar comes from Caesar. It was a direct claim that Moscow was not just another regional principality. It was heir to the legacy of the Roman and Byzantine empires. That claim mattered. Before Ivan, Moscow had been one principality among many, technically under Mongol dominance for centuries. Under Ivan III and then Ivan IV. That changed. Moscow stopped paying tribute. It stopped acting like a junior partner, and it started expanding. The turning point came with two brutal campaigns. In 1552, Russian forces captured the Kazan Khanate. 4 years later, in 1556, they took the Astrakhan Khanate. Those two victories gave Moscow control of the entire Volga River basin, which runs more than 2,000 miles north to south like a spine through western Russia, emptying into the Caspian Sea. Controlling it meant controlling trade, grain transport, military movement, and access to the Caspian. With Kazan and Astrakhan gone, Moscow could move goods south toward Persia and Central Asia. At the same time, the old steppe routes that once allowed Tatar cavalry to strike deep into Russian lands were disrupted. The chain that had connected the nomadic steppe world was broken, and that's when alarm bells started ringing further south. The Crimean Khanate, the most powerful successor of the Golden Horde, depended heavily on mobility. Its cavalry forces, sometimes numbering 40,000 to 60,000 riders in major campaigns, could move fast, strike quickly, and disappear. For generations, they had raided Russian lands, taking captives who were sold in slave markets connected to the Ottoman world. It was a brutal but deeply embedded economic system. The Crimean Khanate was also a vassal of the Ottoman Empire, which at this time was one of the strongest empires on earth. Under Sultan Selim II, the Ottomans controlled territory across 3 continents. Their navy dominated much of the Mediterranean. Their armies had already reached Vienna earlier in the century. They were a global superpower by 16th century standards. So when Moscow absorbed Kazan and Astrakhan, it was pushing directly into what the Ottomans and their Crimean allies considered their sphere of influence. From their perspective, this was an intrusion into the northern frontier of the Islamic world. There was also a bigger economic calculation. The Ottomans had their eyes on Central Asian trade: silk, spices, horses, precious metals, goods moving between Persia, Central Asia, and beyond. Controlling the Caspian Sea would strengthen that position. One ambitious Ottoman idea was to build a canal connecting the Don and Volga rivers. If completed, it would allow Ottoman fleets to move from the Black Sea into the Caspian. That would have been a strategic revolution. The project failed. Logistics fell apart. It damaged Ottoman prestige. After that setback, the leadership in Istanbul needed a visible success in the north, and that pressure fell directly on Devlet. The Khan was expected to deliver results, and quickly. A prolonged campaign would raise doubts. If he failed, his position could weaken overnight. The Giray dynasty had multiple eligible princes. The Sultan could easily replace him with a more obedient relative. But political pressure from Istanbul was only part of the story. Devlet Giray saw himself as the legitimate heir of Genghis Khan. In his view, the princes of Moscow were never equals. They were former tribute collectors, subordinates who had once answered to the steppe Khans. Their expansion into Kazan and Astrakhan was not simply territorial growth. It was a reversal of what he considered the natural order. For many Crimean cavalrymen, the campaign carried religious meaning as well. They viewed it as a jihad, a holy struggle to restore Muslim authority over the Volga region and push back Orthodox Christian control. By the early 1570s, tensions weren't theoretical anymore. The entire region felt like dry timber waiting for a spark. And that spark came in 1571. Devlet I Giray launched a massive raid. He proved that Russia's southern defensive system could be broken. His cavalry moved quickly, bypassed fortifications, and reached Moscow itself. Large parts of the city burned. Estimates vary widely, but somewhere between 10,000 and 80,000 people may have died in the fires and chaos. More than 60,000 were taken captive, marched south, and sold into slavery. Even if we take the lower estimates, the scale is staggering. Ivan IV fled the city. In the political culture of the time, that mattered. A ruler abandoning his capital during invasion damaged his authority. It fed the perception that the Tsar was not in control. Devlet Giray drew a clear conclusion: Russia was finished. He sent Ivan a dagger as a message, basically saying, "Return Kazan and Astrakhan, or face destruction." Even more telling, before the 1572 campaign had even begun, he reportedly started dividing up Russian lands among Crimean nobles. That overconfidence changed the stakes. Devlet Giray wasn't just planning another slave raid. He was preparing to break Moscow permanently, to reduce it back to dependency, maybe even erase its independence altogether. For Ivan IV, that left no middle ground. But Russia in 1572 was not that strong. The Livonian War had been dragging on for more than a decade. Moscow was fighting a coalition that included Poland, Lithuania, and Sweden. Wars like that don't just cost lives, they drain treasuries. Elite troops were tied up in the West. Supplies were stretched thin. The state was spending money faster than it could replace it. At the same time, the southern frontier had to be defended. The abatis line, a system of wooden barriers, felled trees, and fortified towns, was meant to block steppe raids. Maintaining that defensive belt required constant manpower and attention. So Russia was expanding down the Volga, fighting in the Baltic, and defending its southern frontier all at once. And inside the country, things were worse. Ivan's oprichnina had torn the political elite apart. Noble families were executed or exiled. Lands were confiscated. Command structures were disrupted. Fear replaced trust. Experienced leaders disappeared. When you remove a large part of your leadership during wartime, mobilization slows and coordination suffers. By 1572, the system was strained at every level. At the same time, Ivan had built his rule around the idea that Moscow was the third Rome. the last stronghold of true Orthodox Christianity after the fall of Constantinople. If Moscow fell, there would be no second capital waiting in reserve, no backup center of the faith. This was no longer about border skirmishes or prestige. It was about survival. And in that moment, Ivan no longer had the luxury of division. Faced with an existential threat, he made a major political decision. He unified the Oprichnina forces with the Zemsky army, the traditional military forces drawn from regions outside his personal domain. For years, those two structures had operated separately. Now they had to function as one. He placed them under a single commander, Mikhail Vorotinsky. Vorotinsky was a prince with real military skill and experience, fighting steppe forces. But he had also been a victim of Ivan's suspicion. He had been exiled. His property had been confiscated. He had lived under watch. Yet when the crisis came, he was the only commander capable of organizing a serious defense against the Khan. The decision was a gamble. Ivan was putting the fate of his dynasty into the hands of a man he had once humiliated. If Vorotinsky failed, Russia might collapse. If he succeeded, he could become too powerful to control. In 1572, survival came first. Trust could wait. Modern estimates suggest the Russian army under Mikhail Vorotinsky fielded somewhere between 20,000 and 60,000 men. That's a wide range, and historians still debate it. But even at the high end, they were likely outnumbered. At its core were the Streltsy, infantry, armed with early muskets called pistols. Reloading could take 20 to 30 seconds in good conditions. In battle, under pressure, maybe longer. During that time, a soldier was vulnerable. To protect themselves, Streltsy also carried heavy axes called bardiches, which doubled as both weapon and firing support, helping steady the musket while aiming. Supporting them were noble cavalry and Cossacks, horsemen capable of counterattacks, though not as specialized in steppe-style warfare as their opponents. Facing them was the force of Devlet I Girai. From his point of view, Ivan IV had been broken. Devlet Girai convinced himself that the Tsar simply didn't have the strength left to mobilize another serious army. So when he marched north again, he treated it less like a high-risk military campaign and more like a final sweep, almost a hunting expedition to finish off a wounded enemy, reinforced by Ottoman troops. Their total strength is often estimated between 40,000 and 80,000, lines stretching far beyond what a single person could see clearly from the ground. The core of Devlet's army was steppe cavalry. These were highly mobile horse archers, trained from youth, capable of firing composite bows accurately at full gallop. Their bows could punch through armor at close range. Alongside them were around 7,000 Ottoman janissaries, elite infantry, and artillery units supplied by the Ottoman Empire. The janissaries were disciplined, drilled, and experienced in siege warfare. They carried firearms and were trained to advance in formation under fire. That combination, fast cavalry plus professional gunpowder infantry, made the Crimean Ottoman force extremely dangerous. So how does a slower infantry force survive against tens of thousands of fast-moving horse archers on open ground? This is where Russian innovation becomes critical, the Golden Horde. The name means something like wandering town or moving city. It was a mobile defensive system made of large oak shields mounted on wagons or sled-like frames. The wooden panels were thick and sturdy, fitted with firing slits for muskets and small cannons. When assembled, these panels formed a temporary fortress in the middle of open steppe. Inside that perimeter, Streltsy could reload in relative safety. Instead of standing exposed while arrows rained down, they could fire through narrow openings. Small cannons placed behind the walls added short-range punch. If cavalry charged, they'd hit a solid wooden barrier bristling with gun barrels. What made the Golden Horde different from earlier wagon forts, like the Hussite Wagenburg, was flexibility. It wasn't meant to stay fixed in one place. The panels could be dismantled and repositioned quickly. The defensive line could shift as the army moved. If the battlefield changed, the wall could change shape with it. For steppe cavalry, this was a shock. Their entire system relied on mobility and psychological pressure. They would circle, shoot volleys of arrows, provoke panic, and wait for gaps to open. Once formations broke, cavalry would exploit the chaos. Speed and fear were their greatest weapons. That changes the rhythm of the fight. In late July 1572, Devlet I Giray led a massive army north toward the Oka River. The Oka was the last major natural defensive line protecting Moscow from the southern steppe. If that line failed, the road to the capital lay open. The invasion began in earnest around July 26th. At Serpukhov, the Crimean army crossed the Oka River. The crossing itself was a major achievement. Rivers slow armies down. They create bottlenecks. They expose troops midstream, vulnerable to missile fire. But this time, the Russians couldn't hold the line. A forward Russian detachment, about 200 noble cavalry, was quickly overwhelmed. The defensive screen collapsed. From there, Devlet pushed hard along the Serpukhov road toward Moscow. Speed was essential. The plan relied on momentum. Strike fast, break resistance, reach the capital before Russian forces could regroup. For a moment, it looked as if the path was wide open. But Prince Mikhail Vorotinsky had no intention of meeting that army head-on in a single frontal clash. He understood the math. Charging directly into a larger cavalry force on open ground would be suicidal. So, instead of blocking the Khan's advance from the front, he divided his forces. Russian units began shadowing the Crimean army, harassing it from the flanks and probing at its rear. The key move came from the advance guard, under Prince Dmitry Khvorostinin. Khvorostinin led a bold and risky maneuver. He pushed close behind the Crimean army, staying near its rear guard. That kind of proximity was dangerous. If discovered and surrounded, his force could be crushed. On July 28th, near the village of Molodi, he struck. The attack hit the Tatar rear guard hard. It caused real disruption. Devlet Giray suddenly faced a problem he hadn't expected. If Russian forces were strong enough behind him, his army could be cut off from its supply lines and retreat routes. An invading army deep in enemy territory without secure lines to the south is in serious danger, especially one that depends on mobility. For the first time in the campaign, Devlet had to slow down. Instead of racing toward Moscow, he turned his army around to deal with Khvorostinin's force. When Devlet Giray turned back toward Molodi, he wasn't walking into an open field. Prince Mikhail Vorotinsky had already chosen his ground carefully. He set up the Golden Horde on a strategic hill near the village of Molodi. The hill was protected by the Rozaika River on one side and deep ravines on others. Steppe cavalry relies on space, wide, open ground to circle, flank, and surround. At Molodi, that space was limited. The terrain squeezed them toward the fortified center. By July 30th, the first major assault began. Thousands of Tatar horsemen charged toward the Golden Horde. From a distance, it would have looked overwhelming. Waves of cavalry, dust rising, banners moving in the wind. But as they closed in, they ran into something very different from scattered infantry. At close range, Russian streltsy fired volleys of musket shots through firing slits cut into thick oak panels. Early firearms were slow to reload, but at short distance they were devastating. Add small cannons positioned behind those wooden walls, and the effect multiplied. The first ranks of charging cavalry were hit hard. The core strength of steppe warfare, speed and mounted archery, was blunted. Arrows thudded into oak instead of flesh. Cavalry could not easily break through a barrier they couldn't ride around. The fighting turned brutal. Armed with bardiches, long-handled battle axes, the Russian infantry launched short, sudden counterattacks out from gaps in the Golden Horde. They struck quickly, targeting trapped or disorganized enemy units, cutting at horses' legs. dragging riders down, and then pulling back behind the wooden walls. Combat in those narrow approaches became chaotic and bloody. Instead of fluid movement across open steppe, the battle turned into repeated shock assaults against a fortified position that refused to crack. The next day, July 31st, brought a serious blow to the Crimean side. Divy Murza, one of the Khan's most capable commanders, was captured during a Russian counterattack. Losing a senior commander in the middle of a high-stakes invasion created confusion. In pre-modern warfare, communication wasn't instant. Orders traveled by rider. When a key leader disappeared, coordination suffered. Units might hesitate. Others might act without clear direction. August 1st passed in heavy fighting. Artillery and musket exchanges continued. The Ottoman janissaries, trained for siege warfare, attempted to press the assault with discipline and firepower. But the Russians held. Inside the Golden Horde, conditions were getting worse. It was summer. The heat was intense. Thousands of men were packed inside wooden fortifications on a hilltop. Supplies were limited. Water began to run low. Smoke from gunfire hung in the air. Exhaustion set in. Defenders can survive repeated assaults, but only as long as they have the basics to keep going. So, during the deadlock phase of the battle, Yuri Tokmakov, a voivode in Moscow, carried out a calculated trick. He allowed a Tatar patrol to capture a messenger. The messenger carried a letter addressed to Prince Vorotinsky. The contents were explosive. It claimed that Tsar Ivan IV was personally marching toward the battlefield with a massive army of 40,000 men from Novgorod. For comparison, many major European field armies at the time operated in the range of 15,000 to 30,000 soldiers. Hearing that 40,000 fresh troops were approaching would change anyone's calculations. In reality, Ivan IV was nowhere near that close. Devlethy was under enormous pressure. Even the rumor of additional Russian forces moving south would create uncertainty. An invading army deep in hostile territory cannot afford to be surrounded. So instead of maintaining pressure and starving the Russians out, he rushed the decision. He ordered his cavalry to dismount. Fighting on foot against fortified infantry was not their specialty. Still, under pressure to end the battle quickly, the Khan ordered them to join the Ottoman janissaries in a full infantry assault on the Golden Horde. This was the moment when the traditional strength of the steppe army was at its weakest. Thousands of cavalrymen left their horses and advanced on foot alongside the janissaries. The janissaries were experienced in siege warfare, disciplined and used to coordinated infantry assaults. But the Crimean horsemen were not professional assault infantry. They were adapting in real time. The fighting in front of the wooden walls intensified. Muskets fired at close range. Small cannons blasted through tightly packed attackers. Casualties mounted. The narrow terrain near the hill and the ravines made it even harder for the attackers to spread out. While all of this chaos was unfolding in front of the Golden Horde, Prince Mikhail Vorotinsky was executing a plan he had prepared in advance. He quietly led a large portion of his central cavalry force out of the fortified position through a concealed rear path. Using the cover of a deep valley, his troops moved around the battlefield, staying hidden from the main Crimean force. Timing was everything. As the heaviest fighting raged at the front, and the dismounted Crimean troops focused on breaking through the wooden defenses, Vorotinsky's cavalry emerged behind the Khan's army. Then came the signal. At that moment, Vorotinsky's force charged from the rear. Simultaneously, Dmitry Kvorostinin led the remaining Russian troops out from inside the Golden Horde. Attacking from the front, the Crimean Ottoman army suddenly found itself caught between two converging attacks. Infantry units that had advanced toward the fortress were now exposed from behind. In pre-modern battles, panic spreads quickly. Once formations lose cohesion, a few units begin to fall back. Others follow. Soon, retreat turns into flight. Thousands of steppe soldiers rushed back toward the Oka River, trying to escape south. The problem was geography. River crossings that are manageable during an orderly advance become deadly bottlenecks during a retreat. Men and horses crowded the banks. Units collided. Some tried to swim across. Others pushed toward narrow crossing points. Under pursuit from Russian cavalry and Cossack units, including Zaporizhian Cossacks, who were experienced in fast-moving warfare, the retreat collapsed into disaster. When tens of thousands of soldiers try to cross a river at once while being chased, losses multiply rapidly. Drownings, trampling, confusion. The pursuit did not stop at the battlefield. It extended into the retreat itself. By the end of the fighting, the Crimean Ottoman invasion force had suffered catastrophic losses. Exact numbers are debated, but many estimates suggest that a significant portion, possibly tens of thousands, were killed, captured, or scattered during the battle and retreat. What began as a confident march toward Moscow ended in one of the most decisive defeats ever suffered by the Crimean Khanate. And in that moment, the balance along Russia's southern frontier shifted for good. For the Crimean Khanate and the Ottoman Empire, the damage was devastating. A huge portion of Crimea's fighting-age men, the core of its military strength, were killed in that single campaign. Devlet Jure himself lost sons and grandsons at Molodi, the very men expected to succeed him. That kind of loss shakes a ruling dynasty at its core. For the Ottomans, the lesson was harsh. They were forced to accept a hard reality: they could not control the northern frontier through direct military force. The long-term plan to restore Tatar Khanates along the Volga River was effectively abandoned. From this point forward, the Crimean Khanate slowly shifted from being a major expansionist power into something more defensive, focused on raids rather than conquest. The transformation didn't happen overnight, but Molodi marked the beginning of that decline. For the Tsardom of Russia, the outcome was the opposite. Molodi quite literally saved the Russian state. Shortly after Molodi, Russian expansion into Siberia accelerated. What would eventually become a vast empire stretching across Asia rested on the survival secured in 1572. The victory also had political consequences inside Russia. After years of terror under the Oprichnina, Ivan's brutal system of repression and confiscation, Molodi forced a shift. The campaign proved that survival required cooperation with the traditional nobility. The Oprichnina was abolished not long after. Ivan understood that he needed unity to defend the state. But Ivan IV was not a ruler who rewarded success in a simple or predictable way. Mikhail Vorotinsky, the prince who had orchestrated the victory at Molodi and arguably saved the dynasty, did not end his life as a celebrated national hero. Just 1 year later, in 1573, he was arrested. The official accusations were murky. What seems clearer is that Ivan feared his growing prestige. In a system built on absolute power, a victorious general with enormous popularity could be seen as a threat. Vorotinsky was tortured and died shortly afterward. So the man who stopped the Crimean invasion did not survive the peace he helped secure. Molodi feels almost like a tragic historical drama. Military brilliance on one side, paranoia and betrayal on the other. Vorotinsky and his officers had to defeat not only a powerful external enemy, but also survive the internal suspicions of their own ruler. And in his case, he didn't. In the end, Molodi stands as proof that technological adaptation, smart use of terrain, and sheer determination can reverse even the most desperate situation. The battle is often overshadowed by later events in Russian history, but in many ways, it laid the real foundation for the Russian Empire. If you want to stay with the series, consider subscribing, as the channel works toward 80,000 subscribers. Every one of those helps keep projects like this going. And if you've studied this period yourself, or worked with archives, documents, or regional histories, I'd genuinely love to hear from you. If you disagree with one of my interpretations, or think a source points in a different direction, tell us in the comments. That kind of discussion makes this channel better. Thanks for staying with me all the way to the end. I'll see you in the next episode tomorrow.